There was once a book considered so holy that it was read in churches right alongside the Gospels, yet so dangerous that church leaders eventually banned it entirely. This is the Apocalypse of Peter, once a sacred scripture for countless Christians, read alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as authentic scripture for generations. But then something happened that buried this text for over 1,000 years. Today, we're going to uncover every detail of this forbidden scripture and reveal exactly why the early church feared it so much they tried to erase it from history. But before we get started, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a global community here, so you can meet like-minded folks from around the world in the comment section down below. So without further ado, let's dive in, shall we? Discovery in the desert. December 1945. The dry wind carries whispers across the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi. Muhammad Ali al-Saman digs for fertilizer beneath limestone cliffs. His mattock strikes something hard. Clay. Ancient clay. The jar emerges from centuries of sand. Muhammad Ali hesitates. Local tales speak of jinn trapped in vessels, but poverty makes men brave. He swings his tool down. The jar shatters. 13 leather-bound books spill into the sunlight. Papyrus pages flutter like dying birds. The peasant farmer gathers what he can carry. These strange markings might bring coins at the market. He cannot read the words. Cannot know he holds fragments of forgotten Christianity. Among these texts lies a vision so terrifying that early church fathers trembled to name it. The Apocalypse of Peter. The books travel through black market dealers. Scholars catch wind of the discovery. Cables fly between Cairo and European universities. The academic world buzzes with excitement. Ancient manuscripts surface rarely. When they do, they rewrite history. Professor Togo Mina acquires several texts. He photographs pages before they vanish again into private collections. The images reveal Coptic script. Behind the translation lies something older, Greek originals from the 2nd century. Meanwhile, fragments surface elsewhere. The Akhmi manuscript sits in a French museum since 1886. Scholars had dismissed it as unimportant. Now they look again. The pieces begin forming a picture. This particular apocalypse bears Peter's name, the same Peter who denied Christ 3 times, the fisherman who walked on water then sank in doubt. Why would someone place such vivid visions in his hands? The answer waits in the translated pages. Each word reveals a Christianity very different from modern churches. Here, divine justice operates with surgical precision. Every sin receives its perfect punishment. Every act of cruelty finds its mirror in eternity. The Egyptian sun beats down on excavation sites. Archaeologists work quickly. Local politics grow unstable. Foreign scholars face suspicion. Time runs short for proper study. Many texts disappear before translation begins, but enough survives. Enough to reveal a door that early Christianity chose to close. The Apocalypse of Peter shows us what believers once accepted as truth, what they read aloud in church gatherings, what they whispered about in fearful wonder. The desert gives up its secrets reluctantly. Each papyrus fragment crumbles at a touch. Scholars work with tweezers and magnifying glasses. They photograph every line before the ancient fibers return to dust. Modern Egypt seems far from ancient Alexandria. Yet these texts bridge that gap. They carry voices from house churches where Christians gathered in secret, where they debated which books held divine authority, where they decided what future generations would believe. The Apocalypse of Peter emerges from this historical dust storm. A vision so complete, so detailed in its moral accounting that it nearly joined the New Testament, nearly became scripture that billions would memorize. Instead, it vanished. Church leaders grew uncomfortable with its graphic descriptions. They preferred more subtle approaches to divine judgment. The text faded from memory. Only fragments remained, buried in desert sand, until Muhammad Ali's mattock changed everything. His need for fertilizer brought forgotten Christianity back to light. The jar held more than old books. It contained alternative paths that early believers considered sacred. Each translation reveals new horrors, new insights into what terrified ancient minds. The punishments described exceed imagination. They follow logic that seems both alien and familiar. Perfect justice rendered in perfect pain. The discovery shakes scholarly assumptions. Christianity appears less unified than previously thought. Multiple gospels competed for acceptance. Various apocalypses offered different visions of the end times. Church authorities made choices about which voices would survive. These choices shaped everything that followed. They determined what modern believers would read, what they would consider possible, what they would accept as divine truth. The Apocalypse of Peter represents the road not taken, the Christianity that might have been. Its rediscovery opens questions that church historians prefer to avoid, questions about authority, canonization, and the political forces that shape doctrine. The desert wind still blows across Nag Hammadi. Tourists visit the site now. They photograph limestone cliffs and imagine ancient secrets. Most have no idea what was found here, no idea how close this text came to changing everything. The forbidden door stands open once again. Behind it waits a vision of judgment so precise, so unforgiving, that early Christians both embraced and feared it. The Apocalypse of Peter has returned from the sand. Its message echoes across centuries, asking why such detailed moral accounting once seemed necessary. Why did believers need to imagine punishment so specific? What drove them to catalog sins with surgical precision? The answers lie in the text itself, in Peter's strange journey through realms of perfect justice and terrible consequence. Peter's strange vision. The vision begins simply. Peter sits with Jesus on the Mount of Olives. Disciples gather close, asking about the end of days. What signs will herald the final judgment? How will the righteous know their time has come? Jesus responds with prophecy. Wars will multiply. False teachers will deceive many. The sun will darken and the moon will drip blood. Then comes the moment that changes everything. Peter's consciousness shifts. Reality bends around him. He finds himself standing in a place between worlds, neither fully earthly nor completely divine. Light streams from everywhere and nowhere. The air itself seems alive with divine presence. Peter's human eyes struggle to process what they see. Before him stretches a vast plain divided by an enormous chasm. On one side, gardens bloom in eternal spring. Sweet fragrances drift on gentle breezes. Streams of clear water wind between flowering trees. The righteous dead walk in robes of pure light. Their faces glow with perfect peace. But Peter's gaze is drawn across the divide. There, in a realm of shadow and flame, he witnesses something that will haunt Christian imagination for centuries. The punishment of the wicked unfolds with terrifying precision. Each sinner receives correction tailored to their earthly crimes. Liars hang by their tongues over pits of boiling metal. Those who spoke false witness find their mouths filled with fire that never consumes completely. The flames provide eternal agony without the mercy of destruction. Greedy merchants who cheated with false weights and measures stand immersed in pools of molten gold. The metal they pursued in life now surrounds them completely. They reach for the surface, but cannot rise. Their hands melt and reform in endless cycles of futile grasping. Women who adorn themselves to seduce other women's husbands hang by their hair over abysses of flame. Cosmetics they once applied with vanity now burn their faces eternally. Beauty becomes horror. Attraction transforms into repulsion. Men who pursued forbidden relations find themselves driven together in degrading embraces, unable to separate, unable to find satisfaction. Their desires become their prison. What they sought in secret now defines their eternal state. Those who harm children suffer punishments that exceed description. Their torments mirror the innocence they corrupted. The pain they inflicted returns multiplied beyond human comprehension. Divine justice ensures perfect balance. Murderers experience death repeatedly. They fall from great heights, feeling every bone shatter, then immediately reform to fall again. Each impact brings full awareness of their victim's final moments. Empathy becomes their endless torment. Peter watches in growing horror. The precision astounds him. Every crime finds its perfect echo in punishment. Divine accounting operates with mathematical certainty. No detail escapes attention. No sin remains unaddressed. Yet the vision contains mercy alongside judgment. Children who died before reaching moral awareness play in meadows of eternal summer. Their laughter rings across the divide, a reminder that innocence finds protection even in realms of perfect justice. Angels move between the punishments not to provide comfort, but to ensure accuracy. They measure each torment against the sin that earned it. They adjust intensity to match moral weight. Their faces show no emotion, only dedication to divine precision. The righteous dead notice their counterparts suffering but feel no pity. Their sanctification includes proper emotional response to divine justice. They understand that mercy without accountability undermines moral order. They see beauty in the terrible symmetry. Rivers of fire separate different categories of sinners. Each stream burns at temperatures suited to specific crimes. Those who stole from widows and orphans find themselves in cooler flames than those who corrupted whole communities with false teaching. The heat never destroys, but always instructs. Peter realizes he witnesses not arbitrary cruelty, but educational consequence. Each punishment teaches what the sinner failed to learn in life. Pain becomes curriculum. Suffering transforms into understanding. Though understanding comes too late for change, the vision shifts. Peter sees how earthly actions create eternal destinies. Every choice carves channels that determine final destinations. Free will operates constantly, but its effects accumulate beyond reversal. The moment of death simply reveals what souls have become. Angels guide Peter through regions where different types of wickedness receive correction. He observes the geography of judgment, how divine justice organizes itself according to moral categories, how punishment fits crime with artistic precision. The tour continues through areas reserved for religious hypocrites. Those who taught virtue while practicing vice find themselves in elaborate tortures that expose their hidden contradictions. Their public faces melt away, revealing the corruption beneath. Truth becomes inescapable. False prophets who led believers astray face particularly creative corrections. They experience the despair their lies produced in others. They feel the confusion, the lost faith, the spiritual damage multiplied across all their victims. Their influence becomes their agony. But Peter also sees the rewards awaiting faithful souls. Gardens where the righteous walk with patriarchs and prophets, tables spread with foods that nourish without causing satiation, conversations that continue for eternity without exhausting their subjects. The vision overwhelms Peter's human comprehension. He struggles to process the scope of divine justice, the complete accounting of every moral choice, the perfect balance between crime and consequence, the terrible beauty of a universe where nothing escapes notice. As the vision fades, Peter finds himself again on earthly ground, but the images remain burned into his memory, the detailed map of eternity's moral geography, the proof that every action matters infinitely. The revelation that divine justice operates with unimaginable precision. This vision will drive him to share what he has seen, to warn others about the accounting that awaits, to describe the punishments and rewards with unflinching accuracy, even knowing that such vivid moral imagery will disturb as much as it instructs. What is the Apocalypse of Peter? The Apocalypse of Peter belongs to a strange family of ancient texts. They claim to reveal the future through divine visions. But this particular apocalypse pushes boundaries that other texts approach carefully. Where Revelation speaks in symbols, Peter's vision provides graphic details. Where other apocalypses hint at punishment, this text supplies blueprints. The book follows familiar patterns. A chosen figure receives divine revelation. That figure shares what they have seen. The revelation focuses on humanity's final destiny. But Peter's apocalypse diverges from convention in its brutal specificity. Most apocalyptic literature uses symbolic language. Beasts represent empires. Numbers carry hidden meanings. Images require interpretation. The Apocalypse of Peter prefers direct description. Sinners hang by their tongues. Gold melts over greedy merchants. Hair becomes rope for the vain. This literalism sets it apart from canonical revelation. John's vision unfolds in mythic proportions. Dragons and horsemen dominate cosmic battles. The imagery operates on multiple levels, allowing various interpretations. Peter's vision permits no such flexibility. The text likely originated in the 2nd century. Early Christians were still deciding which books deserved authority. Multiple gospels circulated among believers. Various letters claimed apostolic authorship. Different apocalypses competed for acceptance as divine revelation. Peter's name carries weight in this competition. He stood closest to Jesus among the 12 disciples. His authority could validate any text bearing his signature. But scholars doubt that the historical Peter wrote this apocalypse. The Greek style suggests later composition. Whoever wrote it understood Christian concerns about moral accountability. Early believers worried about divine justice. How would God sort righteous from wicked? What standards would apply? How would punishment fit crime? The Apocalypse of Peter provides detailed answers. The text operates as moral instruction disguised as prophetic vision. Each punishment teaches specific lessons about forbidden behavior. Readers learn not just what to avoid, but why avoidance matters. The consequences appear too terrible to risk. This educational function explains the text's popularity among early Christians. Church leaders read it aloud during services. Believers memorized its descriptions of divine justice. The vivid imagery reinforced teaching about moral behavior. Fear became curriculum. But the same vividness that made it useful also made it problematic. As Christianity developed more sophisticated theology, the crude literalism seemed inappropriate. Divine justice deserved more subtle treatment. The graphic descriptions appeared to diminish rather than enhance religious understanding. The Apocalypse of Peter also raises questions about divine mercy. The punishments described seem to continue forever. No possibility of redemption appears. Once judgment falls, consequences become permanent. This conflicts with the developing ideas about divine forgiveness. Later, Christian thought would balance justice with mercy more carefully. Hell might be real, but heaven's doors stayed open for repentance. Divine love could overcome human failure. The Apocalypse of Peter offers no such comfort. Its universe operates by strict moral accounting. The text reveals how early Christians imagined the afterlife before doctrine became standardized. They expected literal punishments for specific sins. They believed divine justice would mirror earthly legal systems. They assumed moral categories would translate directly into eternal consequences. This primitive theology served important functions. It provided clear guidelines for behavior. It assured believers that injustice would ultimately be corrected. It promised that suffering would be balanced by appropriate rewards. It made divine governance comprehensible to human minds. But as Christianity matured, such simple formulations became problematic. Theologians developed more complex understanding of human nature. They recognized that sin involved more than external behavior. They saw spiritual transformation as more important than rule following. The Apocalypse of Peter represents Christianity in its adolescent phase, confident enough to make bold claims about divine truth, not yet sophisticated enough to question those claims' implications. The text shows us believers grappling with fundamental questions about moral order. Its genre places it among works that try to map the invisible world. These texts attempt to describe what lies beyond human experience. They claim authority through divine revelation. They promise to answer questions that philosophy cannot resolve. The apocalyptic imagination serves psychological needs that pure reason cannot satisfy. People want to know that moral choices matter ultimately. They need assurance that justice will prevail eventually. They seek detailed explanations of how divine governance operates. The Apocalypse of Peter feeds this hunger with unprecedented detail. It provides complete maps of moral consequence. It describes divine justice with scientific precision. It promises that every action receives perfect response. Such comprehensive answers prove irresistible to anxious minds. Yet the same completeness that attracts also repels. The punishments described exceed human capacity for cruelty. The moral categories seem arbitrary and culturally specific. The divine justice appears mechanical rather than personal. The vision satisfies intellectual curiosity while troubling spiritual sensibilities. This tension explains the text's complex reception history. Early Christians embraced its moral clarity while questioning its theological implications. Church leaders valued its instructional power while worrying about its crude materialism. The apocalypse served useful functions while creating uncomfortable questions. The Apocalypse of Peter stands as monument to early Christian moral imagination. It shows us believers trying to understand divine justice without adequate theological vocabulary. It reveals the hunger for detailed knowledge about ultimate reality. It demonstrates how vividly religious minds can picture unseen worlds. But it also shows the limitations of purely descriptive approaches to spiritual truth. Some mysteries resist detailed explanation. Some realities transcend human categories. Some questions require faith rather than knowledge. The Apocalypse of Peter attempts to map territories that might be better left unexplored. The shadow canon early Christianity possessed no official reading list. No central authority decided which books counted as scripture. No committee met to establish canonical boundaries. Instead, hundreds of texts competed for acceptance across scattered communities. The process resembled evolution more than legislation. Churches in Rome read different books than churches in Alexandria. Yeah. Syrian Christians preferred certain gospels, while their Egyptian counterparts favored others. Each community developed its own collection of authoritative texts. Unity would come later, imposed from above rather than growing from below. The Apocalypse of Peter thrived in this chaotic environment. Many early Christians considered it genuine apostolic writing. They placed it alongside Gospels and letters that would eventually form the New Testament. Some communities valued it more highly than texts we now consider canonical. The Muratorian fragment, dating from around 200 CE, lists books accepted by Roman Christians. It includes the Apocalypse of Peter, but notes that some believers refused to have it read in church. Even early support came with reservations. The text's graphic content troubled sensitive consciences. Church leaders faced practical problems with such vivid material. How do you read descriptions of eternal torment to mixed congregations? How do you explain divine justice that seems to exceed divine mercy? How do you maintain pastoral care while preaching terrifying punishments? These concerns grew more pressing as Christianity gained social respectability. Constantine's conversion brought new challenges. The faith needed to appeal to educated Romans accustomed to philosophical sophistication. Crude literalism about divine vengeance seemed inappropriate for imperial religion. Meanwhile, other texts offered more palatable alternatives. The Gospel of John provided mystical depths without graphic violence. Paul's letters explored theological complexity while maintaining pastoral sensitivity. The canonical revelation balanced judgment with hope for restoration. But the Apocalypse of Peter retained passionate defenders. Clement of Alexandria, one of early Christianity's greatest scholars, quoted it as authentic scripture. He saw no conflict between its moral intensity and Christian theology. Many believers shared his confidence in the text's authority. The debate reveals deeper tensions within developing Christianity. Should divine justice focus on punishment or restoration? Should apocalyptic literature frighten or encourage? Should religious authority emphasize fear or love? Different answers led to different canonical choices. Geography influenced these decisions significantly. Eastern churches proved more receptive to apocalyptic literature than Western ones. Syrian and Ethiopian Christians preserved texts that Romans rejected. Cultural factors shaped theological preferences more than pure doctrinal considerations. The Apocalypse of Peter survived longest in communities that valued moral instruction over theological sophistication. Rural churches found its clear messages about divine justice more useful than abstract discussions of divine nature. Simple believers appreciated its direct approach to complex questions. But urban intellectuals grew increasingly uncomfortable with the text's primitive theology. They developed more nuanced understanding of human nature and divine justice. The Apocalypse's mechanical approach to moral accounting seemed beneath emerging Christian philosophy. Economic factors also influenced canonical decisions. Papyrus cost money. Scribes required payment. Communities had to choose which texts deserved copying and preservation. Popular texts survived while marginal ones disappeared. The Apocalypse of Peter gradually lost ground in this competitive environment. Political pressures accelerated the winnowing process. Church leaders needed unified doctrine to maintain institutional coherence. Too many competing texts created confusion and division. Canonical boundaries helped establish ecclesiastical authority and theological consistency. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE addressed doctrinal disputes but avoided canonical questions. That work fell to later authorities like Athanasius of Alexandria, whose annual letters listed approved books for church use. His Easter letter of 367 CE effectively established the New Testament canon. The Apocalypse of Peter did not make the final cut. Its graphic descriptions of divine punishment seemed incompatible with developing Christian emphasis on divine love and mercy. Church leaders preferred texts that balanced judgment with hope for redemption. But exclusion from the canon did not mean immediate disappearance. Many Christians continued reading the Apocalypse privately. Monasteries preserved copies alongside other non-canonical texts. The book maintained underground existence even after losing official recognition. Medieval Christians occasionally rediscovered the text and wondered why earlier generations had rejected it. Its moral clarity appealed to reformers who sought to revive primitive Christian intensity. But church authorities consistently discouraged such interest. The shadow canon reveals paths that early Christianity chose not to follow. Alternative gospels that emphasize different aspects of Jesus' teaching, letters that addressed concerns the canonical ones ignored, apocalypses that describe divine justice with varying degrees of mercy. These rejected texts show us what early believers considered possible. They reveal the range of options available before doctrinal boundaries hardened. They demonstrate how differently Christianity might have developed under different circumstances. The Apocalypse of Peter represents one such alternative path, a Christianity more concerned with moral accounting than theological sophistication, a faith that valued detailed knowledge of divine justice over humble acceptance of divine mystery, a religion that preferred fear to comfort as motivation for righteous behavior. Its rejection signals Christianity's choice of certain values over others, mercy over justice, hope over fear, theological sophistication over moral simplicity. These choices shaped everything that followed, determining what millions would believe about divine nature and human destiny. Yet the shadow canon continues to haunt Christian consciousness. Rejected texts surface periodically, raising questions about roads not taken. They force believers to confront the contingent nature of their doctrine. They remind us that other voices once claimed equal authority. The Apocalypse of Peter stands as monument to this alternative Christianity. Its vivid descriptions of divine justice preserve moral imagination that official doctrine chose to suppress. Its detailed accounting of sin and punishment reveals anxieties that canonical texts address more subtly. Understanding the shadow canon helps us appreciate how remarkable the canonical process was. Early Christians made choices that would influence billions of future believers. They decided which voices would be heard and which would fall silent. They shaped not just doctrine, but entire civilization's understanding of divine truth, heaven, hell, and the moral calculus. The Apocalypse of Peter operates like a divine court system. Every sin receives its precisely calculated sentence. Every punishment fits its crime with mathematical precision. No excess, no mercy, no possibility of appeal. Divine justice functions as perfect moral accounting. Blasphemers hang suspended by their tongues. The organ they use to speak against God becomes their eternal anchor. Hot metal flows beneath them, close enough to feel its heat, but never close enough to provide the release of destruction. They dangle in permanent anticipation of a fall that never comes. Women who beautified themselves to seduce married men discover their hair has become unbreakable cord. They hang by these carefully cultivated locks over chasms of flame. The vanity that drove them to perfect their appearance now ensures their perfect suffering. Beauty becomes the instrument of justice. Rich men who refuse charity to the poor find themselves immersed in molten gold up to their necks. The wealth they hoarded melts around them, providing neither comfort nor purchase. They cannot escape what they once pursued. Their treasure becomes their torment. Those who charged excessive interest on loans discover their hands and feet extend unnaturally, stretching toward pools of boiling pitch. They reach desperately for relief that remains forever beyond their grasp. Their greed created distance from human compassion. Now distance defines their eternal condition. Murderers face death repeatedly. They climb high towers, feel themselves pushed over edges, experience every sensation of fatal impact. Then they immediately reform to climb again. Each death brings complete awareness of their victim's final moments. Empathy arrives too late to provide comfort. The precision astounds more than the cruelty. Divine justice operates with scientific accuracy. Each punishment reflects not just the sin, but the specific manner of sinning. Liars who whispered secrets hang by their ears. Those who spoke false witness hang by their tongues. Body parts become instruments of instruction. Children who died before reaching moral awareness play in meadows beside crystal streams. Their laughter provides counterpoint to the groaning of the damned. Innocence receives protection, while guilt receives education. The moral universe maintains perfect balance. Angels supervise each punishment with bureaucratic efficiency. They measure suffering against sin, adjusting intensity to match moral weight. Their faces show no emotion, only dedication to accurate implementation of divine justice. Mercy would compromise the system's integrity. The righteous dead observe these punishments without distress. Their sanctification includes proper emotional response to divine justice. They understand that accountability enhances rather than diminishes divine love. They see beauty in the terrible symmetry, but certain crimes receive punishments that exceed easy description. Those who corrupted children face torments that the text struggles to convey. The damage they inflicted was irreversible. Their punishment must therefore be incomprehensible. Some sins break moral mathematics. False prophets who led believers astray experience psychological rather than physical torment. They feel the despair their lies produced multiplied across all their victims. They carry the weight of every lost soul, every damaged faith, every spiritual wound their deception created. Religious hypocrites find their public masks permanently removed. They cannot hide behind pretense or reputation. Their inner corruption becomes visible to all. They experience shame without possibility of concealment or redemption. Truth becomes their torment. The moral calculus extends beyond individual actions to their consequences. A single lie might destroy a marriage, impoverish children, ruin multiple families. Divine justice accounts for every ripple effect. Sinners bear responsibility not just for their choices, but for all results those choices generated. Greedy merchants discover that their false weights and measures have become the instruments of their torture. They must carry massive scales that never balance, pursuing accuracy they never practiced in life. The tools of their deception become tools of their instruction. Those who practiced witchcraft or consulted spirits find themselves in regions where deception becomes impossible. They sought hidden knowledge through forbidden means. Now they possess complete knowledge of their situation with no power to change it. Truth without hope becomes their punishment. The geography of hell reflects moral categories. Different regions house different types of sinners. Rivers of fire separate various classes of criminals. The landscape itself teaches lessons about the organization of evil and the precision of divine response. Yet the text maintains that this justice serves educational purposes. Each punishment teaches what the sinner failed to learn during life. Pain becomes curriculum. Suffering transforms into understanding, though understanding comes too late to alter consequences. The righteous dead receive rewards that mirror their earthly choices. Those who fed the hungry feast eternally without gluttony. Those who clothed the naked wear garments of light that never fade. Those who visited prisoners walk in perfect freedom. Justice operates in both directions. Gardens bloom where the faithful walk with patriarchs and prophets. Streams of living water refresh without drowning. Tables spread with foods that nourish without causing satiation. Paradise operates by different laws than earth, but the same moral logic applies. The Apocalypse of Peter presents a universe where every choice matters infinitely. No action disappears without consequence. No thought escapes divine attention. The moral calculus operates with perfect accuracy, accounting for every variable in the equation of human responsibility. This comprehensive moral accounting both terrifies and comforts. It terrifies because escape becomes impossible. It comforts because injustice receives correction. The system guarantees that good and evil receive their proper rewards. Perfect justice ensures perfect order. But the text raises troubling questions about divine nature. Does perfect justice require perfect cruelty? Does moral instruction justify eternal suffering? Do the punishments fit the crimes, or do they exceed human capacity to commit equivalent evil? These questions would eventually contribute to the text's exclusion from canonical scripture. Church leaders grew uncomfortable with divine justice that seemed to exceed divine mercy. They preferred more balanced portraits of divine nature that emphasized forgiveness alongside accountability. Yet the Apocalypse of Peter preserves moral imagination that canonical texts address more subtly. It shows us early Christians grappling with fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and divine governance. It reveals their hunger for detailed knowledge about ultimate moral reality. The moral calculus it presents may seem primitive to modern sensibilities, but it addresses permanent human concerns about justice and accountability. It promises that choices matter, actions have consequences, and divine governance operates with perfect accuracy. Such assurances appeal to moral intuitions that transcend cultural boundaries. The rise of apocalyptic literature. The world was ending. Roman boots marched through Jerusalem's streets. The temple burned. Priests scattered. Sacrifices ceased. Jewish hope seemed crushed beneath imperial wheels. In such darkness, visions flourished. When earthly powers destroy divine order, heavenly voices promise restoration. Apocalyptic literature emerges from oppression like flowers from scorched earth. Daniel first established the pattern during Babylonian exile. When foreign gods ruled holy ground, divine visions revealed hidden truths. Heavenly tours showed cosmic battles between good and evil. Earthly defeat transformed into spiritual victory. The Book of Enoch expanded this tradition with elaborate descriptions of celestial realms. Fallen angels corrupted human bloodlines. Giants walked the earth. Divine judgment approached with mathematical precision. Complex moral accounting promised eventual justice. Every detail of cosmic history served divine purposes. Roman oppression provided fresh soil for apocalyptic imagination. Jewish rebels fought impossible battles against overwhelming force. Traditional religion seemed powerless against imperial machinery. Apocalyptic writers offered alternative perspectives on seemingly hopeless situations. These texts operated as resistance literature disguised as religious vision. They promised that earthly empires served divine plans despite appearances. They revealed hidden weaknesses in seemingly invincible powers. They encouraged endurance by describing ultimate victory for the faithful. Early Christians inherited this apocalyptic worldview along with Jewish scriptures. Jesus himself spoke apocalyptically about coming judgment and divine vindication. His followers expected imminent transformation of earthly conditions. The kingdom of heaven would replace all earthly kingdoms, but the expected transformation delayed. Jesus ascended without establishing visible kingdom. Disciples died without witnessing promised return. Roman power grew stronger rather than weaker. Christians needed new explanations for continuing oppression. Apocalyptic literature provided those explanations. Texts like the Apocalypse of Peter revealed why suffering continued and when it would end. They described cosmic battles invisible to human eyes. They promised that apparent delay served larger divine purposes. The genre offered several advantages for embattled Christian communities. It explained present suffering as part of divine plan. It provided detailed knowledge about future vindication. It encouraged endurance through vivid descriptions of eventual reward. It transformed victims into victors through prophetic vision. Apocalyptic authors claimed authority through divine revelation rather than human learning. They received visions directly from heavenly sources. They toured cosmic realms under angelic guidance. They witnessed divine councils planning earthly events. Such claims bypass traditional religious hierarchies. This democratization of divine revelation appealed to marginalized communities. Ordinary believers could receive extraordinary visions. Social outcasts could become prophetic voices. Religious authority flowed from divine choice rather than institutional position. Apocalyptic literature leveled traditional power structures. The texts also satisfied intellectual curiosity about invisible realities. People wanted detailed knowledge about heavenly realms. They sought specific information about divine justice. They desired complete explanations of cosmic purpose. Apocalyptic literature provided such comprehensive answers. Greek philosophical influence shaped Christian apocalyptic imagination. Platonic ideas about invisible perfection behind visible shadows encouraged belief in heavenly realms more real than earthly ones. Stoic concepts of divine governance supported detailed moral accounting. Philosophical vocabulary enriched prophetic vision. But apocalyptic literature maintained distinctly Jewish and Christian concerns. It focused on historical transformation rather than philosophical contemplation. It emphasized divine action in human affairs rather than abstract speculation. It promised justice for the oppressed rather than wisdom for the elite. The Apocalypse of Peter represents this tradition's maturation within Christian circles. It combines Jewish moral categories with Christian salvation history. It uses Greek philosophical concepts to describe Hebrew prophetic vision. It addresses Roman oppression through divine revelation. The text's detailed punishments reflect legal thinking influenced by Roman jurisprudence. Each crime receives proportionate punishment. Justice operates through systematic application of universal principles. Divine law mirrors earthly law while transcending its limitations. Yet, the Apocalypse maintains prophetic criticism of earthly justice systems. It reveals how divine standards exceed human ones. It promises perfect accountability where earthly courts fail. It assures readers that hidden crimes receive public punishment in cosmic venues. Apocalyptic literature thrived during periods of cultural crisis when traditional authorities seemed inadequate. The genre provided alternative sources of meaning and hope. It revealed divine purposes behind apparent chaos. It promised ultimate vindication for faithful endurance. But the same conditions that generated apocalyptic literature also limited its appeal. When external pressure decreased, communities felt less need for cosmic explanations of earthly suffering. When churches gained social acceptance, they preferred less confrontational theology. The rise of apocalyptic literature reflects humanity's need for comprehensive moral explanations. People want to understand why suffering exists and when it will end. They seek assurance that justice will ultimately prevail. They desire detailed knowledge about divine governance. These needs transcend particular historical circumstances. Every generation faces situations that seem to exceed human capacity for resolution. Every age witnesses injustices that earthly powers cannot or will not correct. Every culture produces visions of ultimate accountability. The Apocalypse of Peter preserves one such vision from early Christianity's formative period. It shows us believers grappling with fundamental questions about divine justice and human responsibility. It reveals their confidence that cosmic order underlies apparent chaos, but it also demonstrates the limitations of purely descriptive approaches to spiritual mystery. Some realities resist detailed explanation. Some truths transcend human categories. Some questions require faith rather than knowledge. The rise of apocalyptic literature marks both achievement and failure of religious imagination. It succeeds in maintaining hope during desperate circumstances. It fails when detailed predictions replace humble trust in divine wisdom. The Apocalypse of Peter embodies both this success and this failure. Peter the everyman. Simon, called Peter, stumbles through the Gospels like a man learning to walk on water. He speaks before thinking, acts before understanding, promises more than he can deliver. Yet Jesus chooses him as foundation stone for the church to come. Perhaps divine wisdom sees potential that human eyes miss. The fisherman from Galilee possessed no theological training, no rabbinical credentials, no family connections to religious authority. He worked with his hands, spoke with provincial accent, carried the smell of fish and lake water, common as morning bread, ordinary as evening prayer. But ordinariness made him extraordinary for early Christian purposes. Believers needed an apostolic figure they could understand, someone who struggled with doubt like they did, someone who failed spectacularly then found forgiveness, someone whose weaknesses made divine grace visible. Peter's denials during Jesus' trial became paradoxically reassuring to later Christians. If the chief apostle could fail so completely under pressure, then ordinary believers need not despair over their own failures. If Peter could be restored to fellowship despite his betrayal, then redemption remained possible for everyone. The vision recorded in the Apocalypse of Peter fits perfectly with this pattern. Peter sees divine justice with startling clarity despite his moral failures. The same man who denied knowing Jesus receives detailed revelation about cosmic judgment. Grace operates through flawed vessels rather than perfect ones. Early Christian communities found Peter's humanity more encouraging than Paul's brilliance or John's mystical insights. Paul intimidated with his learning and rhetorical skill. John soared beyond ordinary comprehension. Peter remained accessible. His spiritual authority came through weakness made strong rather than strength displayed. The Apocalypse attributed to Peter exploits this accessibility. The visions seem almost too intense for his simple nature. Divine revelation overwhelms his human capacity. He struggles to process what he sees. This struggle makes the visions more believable rather than less. Readers identify with Peter's amazement at divine justice. They share his horror at the punishments described. They understand his difficulty comprehending such complete moral accounting. The fisherman becomes their guide through realms beyond human experience. Peter's questions throughout the vision reflect ordinary human concerns. He wants to know why certain punishments seem so severe. He struggles to reconcile divine mercy with divine justice. He seeks explanation for suffering that exceeds apparent causes. His confusion mirrors readers' confusion. The text presents Peter as reluctant witness rather than eager prophet. He receives revelation he did not seek about realities he would prefer to avoid. This reluctance adds authenticity to his testimony. Eager prophets might exaggerate for effect. Reluctant witnesses seem more trustworthy. Peter's characterization also serves pedagogical purposes. His questions create opportunities for detailed explanations. His confusion requires careful instruction. His emotional responses model appropriate reactions to divine revelation. The text teaches through his learning process. But the apocalypse also transforms Peter in ways that earlier gospel portraits do not suggest. The impulsive fisherman becomes patient observer of divine justice. The man who cut off a soldier's ear in Jesus' defense watches eternal punishments without protest. The apostle who wept bitterly over his denials shows no emotion at cosmic suffering. This transformation reflects early Christian understanding of spiritual maturation. Resurrection appearances changed the disciples fundamentally. They received new capacity for divine revelation. Their human limitations became channels for heavenly wisdom rather than obstacles to spiritual understanding. Peter's evolution from denier to visionary offered hope to struggling believers. If divine grace could transform such complete failure into apostolic authority, then no one remained beyond redemption. The worst sinner could become the greatest saint through divine intervention. The apocalypse exploits Peter's reputation for emotional volatility. His passionate nature made him credible witness to emotional content. A cooler temperament might describe horrific punishments with detachment. Peter's intensity convinces readers that the visions genuinely disturbed him. Yet the text requires Peter to maintain composure throughout his cosmic tour. He asks questions but never protests divine justice. He expresses amazement but never objects to punishments. His humanity remains subordinate to his prophetic function. This balance between accessibility and authority made Peter ideal vehicle for apocalyptic literature. Believers could identify with his human struggles while accepting his divine revelations. They trusted his testimony because they recognized his limitations. His weaknesses validated his strengths. Peter's presence in the apocalypse also legitimized its theological claims. The chief apostle's endorsement carried weight that anonymous visions could not match. Church communities already familiar with Peter's gospel appearances would accept revelations bearing his name. The text presents Peter as bridge between earthly and heavenly realms. His human nature enables communication with ordinary believers. His apostolic authority validates divine revelations. He translates cosmic truths into comprehensible language. But Peter's everyman quality creates tension with the apocalypse's sophisticated moral categories. The simple fisherman suddenly demonstrates detailed knowledge of divine justice. His vocabulary expands to encompass theological concepts beyond his apparent education. This tension reflects broader challenges in apocalyptic literature. How do human authors convey divine revelations without exceeding their natural capacities? How do they maintain credibility while describing impossible experiences? The Peter figure attempts to resolve these contradictions. The apocalypse presents Peter's visions as gift rather than achievement. He receives revelation through divine grace rather than human effort. This emphasis preserves his humble status while explaining his extraordinary knowledge. Divine initiative bridges the gap between human limitation and cosmic truth. Peter's emotional responses throughout the vision also model appropriate Christian attitudes toward divine justice. He expresses proper awe at heavenly realms. He shows appropriate concern for human suffering. He demonstrates correct submission to divine authority. These modeled responses teach readers how they should react to the apocalypse's content. Peter's emotional journey becomes instruction manual for proper spiritual response. His transformation from confusion to acceptance charts the path believers should follow. The text uses Peter's presence to address objections that later readers might raise. If the punishments seem excessive, Peter's acceptance validates their appropriateness. If divine justice appears unmerciful, Peter's acquiescence confirms its necessity. The apostles' approval preempts criticism. Yet Peter's humanity also limits the apocalypse's theological sophistication. Complex philosophical arguments would exceed his apparent capacity. Subtle theological distinctions might confuse his simple nature. The text must maintain consistency with his character while conveying divine revelation. This limitation shapes the apocalypse's direct, literal approach to divine justice. Peter receives visions he can understand and descriptions he can convey. The sophisticated allegory of canonical revelation would exceed his interpretive abilities. Simple moral categories suit his straightforward nature. Peter's everyman quality made the apocalypse of Peter accessible to ordinary Christian believers. They saw themselves in his confusion, his questions, his gradual understanding. They trusted testimony from someone who shared their struggles with faith and doubt. But this same accessibility eventually contributed to the text's exclusion from canonical scripture. As Christianity developed more sophisticated theology, Peter's simple moral categories seemed inadequate. Church leaders preferred more nuanced approaches to divine justice. The fisherman from Galilee served early Christianity's need for accessible apostolic authority. He bridged the gap between divine revelation and human understanding. He made cosmic truths comprehensible to ordinary minds. His presence validated extraordinary claims. Yet Peter's limitations also constrained the apocalypse's theological development. His character could not evolve beyond certain boundaries without losing credibility. The text remained trapped within parameters established by gospel portraits. The Apocalypse of Peter preserves Peter's everyman appeal while stretching it toward prophetic authority. The result reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of using familiar figures to validate new revelations. Accessibility and authority sometimes conflict in ways that compromise both. Competing visions of the end. The early Christian world buzzed with competing apocalypses. Each text claimed divine authority. Each vision promised unique insights into humanity's final destiny. Each apocalypse attracted devoted followers who insisted their chosen revelation contained complete truth. The marketplace of ideas operated without regulatory oversight. The Apocalypse of Paul emerged from Egyptian monasteries, claiming to reveal the apostles' journey through heavenly realms. Paul receives guided tour of paradise and punishment. Angels explain divine justice with patient detail. The vision emphasizes mercy more than judgment, forgiveness more than condemnation. Where Peter's apocalypse focuses on punishment fitting crime, Paul's emphasizes divine compassion for human weakness. Sinners receive correction designed for restoration rather than retribution. Even the damned benefit from Sunday respites when torments cease temporarily. Divine love operates alongside divine justice. The shepherd of Hermas offers yet another perspective on divine judgment. Hermas receives visions through angelic intermediary who appears as shepherd. The revelations emphasize repentance and moral reformation rather than cosmic punishment. Individual transformation matters more than cosmic transformation. Hermas sees the church as tower under construction. Some stones fit perfectly into divine architecture. Others require reshaping before they become useful. A few must be rejected entirely. But the building process continues with patience and skill. Divine grace provides multiple opportunities for spiritual reconstruction. This vision appealed to communities struggling with membership questions. What happens to Christians who sin after baptism? Can they receive forgiveness again? How many chances does divine mercy provide? The shepherd answers with hope rather than terror. The canonical revelation of John operates on completely different scale. John sees cosmic battles between good and evil. Dragons and beasts represent earthly powers that oppose divine authority. Symbolic numbers carry hidden meanings about historical events and future transformations. John's visions require interpretation. The imagery operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Earthly events reflect heavenly realities. Political developments fulfill prophetic patterns. History moves toward predetermined climax despite apparent chaos. Divine sovereignty encompasses all earthly contingencies. These different approaches reflected varying community needs and theological preferences. Urban churches with educated membership preferred symbolic complexity. Rural communities appreciated literal descriptions. Persecuted believers wanted cosmic vindication. Established churches emphasized moral instruction. The Apocalypse of Peter carved unique niche in this competitive environment. Its detailed punishments satisfied curiosity about divine justice. Its moral categories provided clear behavioral guidance. Its pedagogical approach served instructional purposes. Its graphic content created memorable impressions, but comparison with alternatives revealed the text's limitations. Paul's Apocalypse offered more sophisticated theology. Hermas provided more pastoral sensitivity. John delivered more literary sophistication. Peter's vision seemed crude by contrast with these alternatives. The competitive environment also encouraged textual development. Scribes expanded popular apocalypses with additional visions and explanations. Communities added local concerns to universal revelations. Translations adapted content for different cultural contexts. Texts evolved through use rather than remaining static. This fluidity makes it difficult to establish original forms of early Christian apocalypses. Multiple versions circulated simultaneously. Different communities preserved different traditions. Scholars must reconstruct development patterns from fragmentary evidence. The Apocalypse of Peter survived in multiple forms reflecting this evolution. Ethiopic versions contain material absent from Greek fragments. Latin translations include passages not found in Coptic texts. Each tradition preserved elements while losing others, but certain features distinguished Peter's Apocalypse from its competitors throughout this development. The detailed correspondence between sin and punishment remained constant. The literal approach to divine justice persisted. The pedagogical emphasis continued across versions. These distinguishing features appealed to specific audiences while alienating others. Communities that valued moral instruction appreciated the clear behavioral guidance. Churches that emphasized theological sophistication found the literal approach problematic. The competitive environment gradually favored texts that balanced multiple concerns effectively. John's revelation combined symbolic depth with pastoral application. It addressed persecution while maintaining hope. It provided specific enough detail to seem authentic while remaining general enough to apply across circumstances. The Shepherd of Hermas succeeded by focusing on practical questions about Christian living. It addressed real problems that communities face daily. Its visions served immediate needs rather than satisfying abstract curiosity. Its authority derived from usefulness rather than claims about apostolic authorship. Paul's Apocalypse attracted followers through its emphasis on divine mercy. It promised eventual restoration for all creation. It balanced justice with forgiveness in ways that comforted troubled consciences. Its theology developed beyond primitive moral accounting. These successful texts shared certain qualities that Peter's Apocalypse lacked. They offered hope alongside judgment. They provided theological sophistication alongside moral instruction. They balanced divine transcendence with divine accessibility. They served multiple community functions rather than single purposes. The Apocalypse of Peter's eventual marginalization resulted partly from its inability to compete effectively in this diverse marketplace. Its strengths appealed to specific audiences, but its limitations alienated broader constituencies. Its graphic content both attracted and repelled potential readers. Yet, the competitive environment also preserved the text longer than it might otherwise have survived. Different communities maintained different canonical preferences. Texts rejected in one region found acceptance in another. The Apocalypse of Peter continued circulation even after losing official recognition. The competing visions reveal how early Christianity struggled to understand divine justice and human destiny. Different communities reached different conclusions about divine nature and human responsibility. Various apocalypses reflected these diverse theological preferences. Modern readers benefit from this diversity by seeing the range of options available to early believers. The canonical process selected certain visions while rejecting others. But the rejected alternatives show us what might have been. They reveal paths that early Christianity chose not to follow. The Apocalypse of Peter represents one such alternative path, a Christianity focused primarily on moral accounting rather than theological sophistication, a faith that valued detailed knowledge of divine justice over humble acceptance of divine mystery, a religion that preferred fear to comfort as motivation for righteous behavior. Its competition with alternative visions helps explain both its temporary success and eventual failure. The text served important functions for early Christian communities, but it could not adapt effectively to changing theological preferences and pastoral needs. Its rigidity became liability rather than strength. The Torments, a guided tour. The journey begins at the edge of a vast chasm. Peter stands beside Jesus on ground that feels solid beneath his feet, yet somehow exists between earth and heaven. Before them stretches a landscape divided by absolute moral geography. Light and shadow mark eternal boundaries that no soul can cross. To the right, gardens bloom in perpetual spring. Clear streams wind between flowering trees. The righteous dead walk in robes of pure light, their faces reflecting perfect peace. They move with purpose, but without haste, engaged in conversations that stretch across centuries without exhausting their subjects. But Peter's attention draws leftward toward regions where divine justice operates with surgical precision. The air shimmers with heat from fires that burn without consuming. Voices rise in harmonies of pain that never achieve resolution. This is where sinners learn what they failed to understand during life. The first region houses those who spoke falsely against their neighbors. They hang suspended by their tongues over pools of molten metal. The organ they use to destroy reputations becomes their eternal anchor. They cannot speak, cannot cry out, cannot explain or excuse. Truth becomes visible in their suffering. Their tongues stretch unnaturally long, bearing the full weight of their bodies. The flesh never tears despite the impossible strain. Divine justice ensures that punishment matches crime precisely. Those who whispered lies hang lower than those who proclaimed them boldly. Each position reflects the specific damage their words created. Moving deeper into this moral landscape, Peter encounters women who adorn themselves to seduce other women's husbands. They hang by their carefully cultivated hair over abysses of flame. The beauty they perfected for corruption now ensures their perfect correction. Vanity becomes the instrument of instruction. Their hair never burns despite proximity to the fires below. Each strand holds strong as iron while remaining sensitive to every sensation. They feel the heat but cannot escape it, cannot cut their locks or climb upward. The very femininity they weaponize now imprisons them completely. In adjacent regions, those who charged excessive interest suffer punishments that reflect their greed. They stand immersed to their necks in rivers of molten gold. The wealth they pursued now surrounds them completely. They cannot escape what they once coveted, cannot purchase relief with the treasure that destroys them. Their hands reach constantly toward the surface but cannot break through. The gold maintains perfect fluidity that offers no purchase. They sink slightly with each desperate attempt to rise. Their treasure becomes their tomb, beautiful and terrible simultaneously. Peter observes merchants who used false weights and measures. They carry massive scales that never achieve balance. The instruments of their deception become tools of their eternal education. They must pursue accuracy they never practiced in life. Perfect weights remain forever beyond their manipulation. Each scale grows heavier with use rather than lighter. The merchants stumble under increasing burdens that reflect the cumulative damage their dishonesty created. They cannot rest, cannot delegate, cannot abandon their impossible task. Divine justice requires personal accountability. Those who practiced witchcraft or consulted forbidden spirits find themselves in regions where deception becomes impossible. They sought hidden knowledge through illegitimate means. Now they possess complete knowledge of their situation with no power to change it. Truth without hope becomes their punishment. Demons they once summoned now serve as their jailers. The spirits mock their former allies with perfect cruelty. The magical powers they pursued in life operate against them with flawless efficiency. Their occult knowledge reveals only the completeness of their condemnation. Peter witnesses punishments for sins against children that exceed his capacity to describe fully. The text itself struggles to convey torments that match crimes so fundamentally destructive. Some corruptions break moral mathematics entirely. Divine justice transcends human ability to comprehend or explain. The geography itself teaches lessons about the organization of evil. Rivers of fire separate different categories of sinners. Each stream burns at temperatures suited to specific crimes. Those who harm children suffer in the hottest flames. Those who merely gossiped endure cooler correction. Angels move between regions with bureaucratic efficiency. They measure suffering against sin, adjusting intensity to maintain perfect proportions. Their faces show no emotion, only dedication to accurate implementation of divine justice. Mercy would compromise the system's integrity. But the tour also reveals unexpected mercy within perfect justice. Children who died before reaching moral awareness play in meadows beside crystal streams. Their laughter provides counterpoint to adult suffering. Innocence receives protection, while guilt receives education. The righteous dead observe these punishments without distress. Their sanctification includes proper emotional response to divine justice. They understand that accountability enhances rather than diminishes divine love. They see beauty in the terrible symmetry that maintains cosmic order. Peter's guide explains that each punishment serves educational purposes. Pain becomes curriculum designed to teach what sinners failed to learn during life. Suffering transforms into understanding, though understanding comes too late to alter consequences. Divine pedagogy operates with infinite patience. The most elaborate punishments await religious hypocrites and false teachers. They experience psychological torments that exceed physical ones. They feel the despair their lives produced multiplied across all their victims. They carry responsibility for every damaged soul their deception created. Their public masks remain permanently removed. They cannot hide behind reputation or pretense. Their inner corruption becomes visible to all. They experience shame without possibility of concealment or redemption. Truth becomes their most unbearable torment. Some regions contain sinners whose crimes were so subtle that earthly law could not address them. Those who destroyed marriages through gossip, those who corrupted children through bad example, those who led others astray through spiritual negligence. Divine justice accounts for every consequence of every choice. The detailed tour overwhelms Peter's human comprehension. He struggles to process the scope of divine moral accounting. Every action monitored, every thought evaluated, every consequence traced to its source. The universe operates as vast courtroom where nothing escapes judgment. As the vision concludes, Peter understands that he has witnessed not arbitrary cruelty, but educational consequence. Divine justice operates as perfect teaching system designed to ensure that truth becomes inescapable. The punishments fit not just the crimes, but the specific blindness that enabled them. The tour leaves Peter forever changed. He has seen the complete moral architecture of the universe. He understands that every choice matters infinitely. He knows that divine justice operates with mathematical precision that accounts for every variable in human responsibility. This knowledge becomes burden and blessing simultaneously. Burden because the accounting terrifies. Blessing because justice guarantees that evil receives its due. The vision provides both warning and comfort, depending on the moral condition of its recipient. What the early church feared. Early Christian communities lived with death as their closest neighbor. Plagues swept through cities without warning. Childbirth claimed mothers routinely. Violence erupted over religious differences. Roman authorities could order executions on imperial whim. Life ended suddenly, often brutally, always definitively. This proximity to mortality sharpened spiritual anxieties that comfortable modern believers rarely experience. Death might arrive before repentance could be completed. Divine judgment might fall before moral reformation could be achieved. Eternity might begin while spiritual accounts remained unbalanced. The Apocalypse of Peter speaks directly to these anxieties with surgical precision. Every fear receives detailed treatment. Every worry finds specific address. The text operates like diagnostic manual for spiritual terror, cataloging symptoms while prescribing remedies through graphic deterrence. Christians feared that their secret sins remained hidden from human authority, but visible to divine surveillance. The apocalypse confirms their worst suspicions. Divine justice operates with complete knowledge of every action, every thought, every hidden motivation. Nothing escapes cosmic accounting. Private sins receive public punishment in Peter's vision. Adulterers who concealed their crimes from spouses find their corruption displayed before all creation. Thieves who covered their tracks discover their greed exposed eternally. Secrecy provides no protection from ultimate revelation. But the text reveals that early Christians feared specific sins more than others. Sexual corruption tops every punishment list. Those who violated marriage bonds, seduced virgins, or engaged in forbidden relationships face elaborate torments. Sexual purity obsessed early Christian communities. This obsession reflected cultural context more than universal moral principles. Roman society operated with sexual freedoms that scandalized Jewish and Christian sensibilities. Temple prostitution normalized behaviors that monotheistic faiths considered abominable. Sexual restraint became marker of religious identity. Women who beautified themselves to attract inappropriate attention receive particular condemnation in the Apocalypse. Their hair becomes rope. Their cosmetics become fire. Their jewelry becomes chains. The text reveals deep anxiety about female sexuality and its power to corrupt male virtue. Early Christian communities struggled with questions about female participation in religious life. Could women teach? Could they speak in assemblies? Could they exercise authority over men? The Apocalypse of Peter suggests that female beauty itself poses spiritual danger, requiring divine correction. Economic anxieties also permeate the text's punishments. Merchants who cheated customers face eternal consequences. Those who charged excessive interest suffer molten gold immersion. Rich people who ignored poor neighbors endure carefully calibrated torments. Wealth itself becomes suspect. These concerns reflected economic realities in early Christian communities. Most believers belonged to artisan and merchant classes that operated on narrow profit margins. Economic survival required careful attention to fair dealing. Religious communities depended on voluntary contributions that wealth inequality could undermine. But the Apocalypse also reveals fears about religious authority and orthodoxy. False teachers face punishments that exceed those given to ordinary sinners. They experience psychological torments that multiply their victims' suffering. Their responsibility extends beyond personal sin to communal damage. Early Christianity lacked centralized authority to establish doctrinal boundaries. Multiple teachers competed for influence. Various interpretations of Christian truth circulated simultaneously. Communities worried about following deceptive leaders who might jeopardize their eternal destinies. The text addresses parental anxieties about child rearing in morally dangerous environments. Those who corrupted children through bad example or active harm face torments that exceed description. Parents needed assurance that divine justice would protect innocence, even when human law failed. Children represented both hope and vulnerability for early Christian communities. They carried faith into future generations but required protection from corrupting influences. The Apocalypse promises that those who damage young souls will face consequences that match their crimes' gravity. Religious hypocrisy generated particularly intense anxiety because it combined spiritual and social dangers. Hypocrites corrupted religious community while maintaining public respect. They damaged faith from within while appearing exemplary from without. Their deception threatened both individual and communal salvation. The Apocalypse of Peter exposes religious masks with divine X-ray vision. Hypocrites cannot maintain pretense under perfect scrutiny. Their inner corruption becomes visible to all. They experience shame without possibility of concealment or redemption. Truth becomes their unbearable torment. Early Christians also feared that divine justice might be delayed so long that evil would seem to triumph permanently. The Apocalypse addresses this concern by providing detailed accounts of eventual punishment. Justice operates with perfect accuracy despite apparent delays. But the text reveals deeper fears about divine nature itself. Does perfect justice require perfect cruelty? Does moral instruction justify eternal suffering? Does divine love operate alongside divine wrath, or does one exclude the other? The Apocalypse provides answers that later theologians would find troubling. The graphic punishments suggest that early Christians imagined divine justice in thoroughly legal terms. Crime must be followed by proportionate punishment. Moral accounting must balance perfectly. Divine governance must operate according to principles that human minds can understand and approve. This legalistic approach to divine justice both comforted and terrified early believers. It comforted because it guaranteed that evil would receive correction. It terrified because it promised that personal failures would also receive perfect punishment. Divine justice operated without favoritism or mercy. Women faced particular anxieties in early Christian communities because they possessed fewer legal protections and economic options. The apocalypse addresses their concerns by showing that divine justice protects the vulnerable while punishing those who exploit weakness. Yet the text also reveals cultural anxieties about female nature that modern readers find disturbing. Women appear primarily as sources of temptation or victims of male corruption. Their spiritual capacity seems limited to roles that support rather than lead religious communities. Early Christians feared that their religious conversion might not protect them from divine judgment if their moral transformation remained incomplete. The apocalypse suggests that divine justice evaluates actual behavior rather than religious profession. Conversion provides opportunity rather than guarantee. This concern reflects the practical difficulties of moral reformation in corrupt environments. How could believers avoid contamination while remaining engaged with unconverted neighbors? How could they maintain spiritual purity while meeting economic necessities? The apocalypse provides motivation through detailed consequences. The fears cataloged in the Apocalypse of Peter reveal early Christianity's struggle to maintain moral standards while engaging corrupt society. Believers needed clear boundaries between acceptable and forbidden behavior. They required detailed knowledge about divine expectations and consequences. But these same fears also shaped Christian theology in ways that later generations would find problematic. The emphasis on punishment rather than restoration, the focus on individual accountability rather than communal transformation, the preference for fear rather than love as spiritual motivation. Understanding what early Christians feared helps explain both the apocalypse of Peter's initial popularity and its eventual rejection. The text addressed real anxieties that canonical books handled more subtly. It provided detailed answers that sophisticated theology would consider inappropriate. Alexandria, the battleground of belief. The ancient city of Alexandria stretched along Egypt's coast like a jewel catching Mediterranean light. Ships from across the known world crowded its harbor, their holds heavy with goods and ideas. Merchants haggled in a dozen tongues while scholars debated in shadowed courtyards. This was no ordinary port city. Alexandria had become the beating heart of early Christian thought. The great library stood as testament to human hunger for knowledge. Scrolls filled countless shelves, each one a doorway to wisdom or heresy, depending on who held the key. Christian scribes worked alongside pagan philosophers, Jewish rabbis, and mysterious followers of distant gods. Their reed pens scratched across papyrus, copying texts that would shape souls for centuries. In the narrow streets beyond the library, theological battles raged with surprising heat. Groups of believers gathered in homes and workshops, each claiming to possess the true gospel. Some followed the teachings of Arius, who argued that Christ was lesser than the Father. Others embraced Gnostic mysteries, seeking secret knowledge hidden from common folk. Still others held fast to what they called orthodox faith, though that term meant different things to different people. The Apocalypse of Peter found fertile ground in this chaos of competing truths. Wealthy merchants funded scribes to copy the text, sensing its power to guide moral behavior in their trading houses. Ascetic monks carried handwritten versions into the desert, using Peter's visions to fuel their own spiritual discipline. Teachers in the catechetical school included passages in their lessons, watching as students' eyes widened at descriptions of divine justice. Alexandria's papyrus trade made copying texts remarkably easy. Local workshops could produce dozens of copies within weeks, spreading new ideas faster than anywhere else in the empire. The Apocalypse of Peter rode these currents of information, multiplying across the city's Christian communities like seeds on fertile wind. Theological debates in Alexandria often turned personal. Bishops accused rivals of teaching false doctrine, while crowds gathered to hear public arguments about Scripture. The Apocalypse of Peter became ammunition in these conflicts. Some leaders praised its moral clarity and apostolic authority. Others questioned its harsh imagery and uncertain origins. In the city's Jewish quarter, rabbis watched Christian developments with keen interest. Many recognized elements of their own apocalyptic traditions in Peter's visions. The descriptions of punishment echoed themes from the Book of Enoch and other texts their ancestors had treasured. This familiarity made some Jews more sympathetic to Christian claims, while others saw dangerous distortions of sacred truth. Women played crucial roles in Alexandria's Christian networks, though history has often forgotten their contributions. Wealthy widows funded copying projects and hosted house churches where new texts were read aloud. Female teachers shared Peter's visions with younger believers, emphasizing the text's warnings about moral purity and divine judgment. The Apocalypse of Peter thrived in Alexandria because the city itself embodied spiritual seeking. People came there hungry for answers to life's deepest questions. They wanted to know what waited beyond death, how to live righteously, and what God expected from faithful believers. Peter's detailed visions offered concrete answers to abstract fears. Alexandria's Christian communities developed their own interpretations of the text. Some emphasized its warnings about wealth and greed, appealing to working people struggling under Roman taxation. Others focused on punishments for false teaching, using Peter's authority to attack theological opponents. The text became a mirror reflecting each group's particular anxieties and hopes. The city's intellectual atmosphere also bred criticism of the Apocalypse of Peter. Sophisticated theologians questioned its crude imagery and simplistic moral framework. They preferred more refined approaches to divine truth, finding Peter's visions uncomfortably vivid and theologically naive. These educated critics would eventually help turn opinion against the text. But for decades, Alexandria remained the Apocalypse of Peter's strongest fortress. The city's networks of believers, scribes, and teachers ensured its survival when other regions began to doubt. Alexandria had always been a place where dangerous ideas found welcome. The Apocalypse of Peter was simply the latest example of this ancient tradition. The case for inclusion. The year 200 brought unusual excitement to Christian communities across the empire. Bishops, teachers, and ordinary believers sensed they stood at a crossroads. The faith that had begun with a small group of fishermen and tax collectors now numbered in the hundreds of thousands. But with growth came questions that demanded answers. Which books truly came from the apostles? What texts deserved a place alongside the Hebrew scriptures their Jewish ancestors had preserved? The Apocalypse of Peter entered these discussions with impressive credentials. Its title claimed apostolic authorship, linking it directly to the fishermen who had walked with Jesus. Early copies circulated with testimonies from respected church leaders who vouched for its authenticity. The text itself spoke with prophetic authority, offering detailed revelations about humanity's final destiny. Bishop Clement of Alexandria emerged as one of the text's strongest supporters. His reputation for learning and piety carried weight throughout the Christian world. Clement had studied both pagan philosophy and Christian scripture, giving him unique insight into distinguishing truth from error. When he endorsed the Apocalypse of Peter as genuine apostolic teaching, many believers took notice. Clement's arguments for inclusion rested on several pillars. The text's moral teachings aligned perfectly with other accepted Christian writings. Its emphasis on righteous living and divine justice echoed themes found in Matthew's Gospel and Paul's letters. The detailed descriptions of future punishment served a practical purpose, encouraging believers to resist temptation and persevere through persecution. The Muratorian fragment, a list of accepted Christian books from around 200, included the Apocalypse of Peter alongside Gospels and epistles that later generations would consider unquestionably canonical. This early recognition suggested broad acceptance among church leaders of the time. The text appeared to have passed whatever tests early Christians used to evaluate religious writings. Other influential voices joined the chorus of support. Methodius of Olympus praised the text's vivid portrayal of divine justice. Eusebius himself, despite later reservations, initially acknowledged its popularity and apostolic claims. Teachers in Christian schools used passages from the Apocalypse of Peter to illustrate moral lessons, treating it as scripture worthy of study and memorization. The text's supporters emphasized its practical value for Christian living. Unlike abstract theological treatises, the Apocalypse of Peter offered concrete images that common believers could understand and remember. A merchant tempted to cheat customers might recall Peter's description of the greedy hanging by their tongues over lakes of fire. A parent struggling to discipline children could point to the text's warnings about those who disobey divine authority. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites supports the text's widespread acceptance. Fragments of the Apocalypse of Peter have been found in locations across the Mediterranean world, suggesting active copying and distribution networks. Some manuscripts show signs of heavy use, indicating regular reading in worship settings or personal devotion. The text also gained support through its connection to other respected apocalyptic writings. Christians already treasured the revelation of John, despite its challenging symbolism and mysterious imagery. The Apocalypse of Peter offered a companion vision, filling gaps in understanding about the afterlife that John's text left unexplored. Together, they seem to provide a complete picture of humanity's ultimate destiny. Political considerations also favored inclusion. The Roman Empire continued to persecute Christians sporadically, creating ongoing pressure to maintain unity and orthodoxy. Texts that emphasized divine judgment against the wicked offered comfort to believers suffering under imperial oppression. The Apocalypse of Peter promised that earthly injustices would be corrected in the world to come. Liturgical use provided another argument for canonization. Several Christian communities incorporated readings from the Apocalypse of Peter into their worship services, particularly during seasons focused on repentance and preparation for Christ's return. This practical acceptance suggested that ordinary believers found the text spiritually nourishing and doctrinally sound. The momentum for inclusion seemed unstoppable during the early 3rd century. Respected bishops endorsed the text, scholars defended its authenticity, and believers across the empire treasured its teachings. The Apocalypse of Peter appeared destined to join the collection of books that would define Christian faith for future generations. But appearances, as the text itself warned, could be deceiving. The case for exclusion. The tide began to turn in unexpected ways. Bishop Serapion of Antioch stood before his congregation one morning, his face grave with concern. Word had reached him about a church in nearby Rosses that had been reading from the Gospel of Peter during worship services. Initially, Serapion had approved the practice, trusting the apostolic name attached to the text. But deeper investigation revealed troubling doctrinal problems that forced him to reverse his position. This incident, recorded in church history, marked a turning point in attitudes toward Petrine literature. If one text bearing Peter's name could mislead believers, perhaps others deserved closer scrutiny. The Apocalypse of Peter, despite its popularity, found itself caught in this wave of suspicion about pseudepigraphic writings. Theological objections multiplied as scholars examined the text more carefully. The crude descriptions of punishment seemed beneath the dignity of divine revelation. Critics argued that God's justice operated through spiritual transformation rather than physical torture. The Apocalypse of Peter's graphic imagery reduced complex theological concepts to simple cause and effect relationships that sophisticated believers found intellectually unsatisfying. Questions about authorship proved particularly damaging. Advanced textual analysis revealed linguistic patterns inconsistent with first-century Palestinian origins. The Greek showed influences from later periods and different geographical regions. Scholars who had initially accepted Petrine authorship began to doubt whether the historical Peter could have produced such a work. The text's moral framework also drew criticism from unexpected quarters. Some church leaders worried that its emphasis on punishment through fear rather than love contradicted core Christian teachings about divine mercy and redemption. The Apocalypse of Peter seemed to encourage believers to avoid sin, primarily to escape consequences rather than to grow in holiness and compassion. Doctrinal concerns multiplied as theological understanding became more sophisticated. The text's anthropology, or understanding of human nature, appeared overly simplistic to teachers grappling with complex questions about the soul, resurrection, and eternal destiny. Its eschatology, or teaching about the end times, seemed to conflict with more nuanced interpretations of Christ's second coming and final judgment. Regional variations in Christian practice created additional problems for the Apocalypse of Peter. Churches in different areas had developed distinct traditions about which texts to read in worship and instruction. The text remained popular in some regions while falling out of favor in others. This geographical division undermined claims about its universal acceptance and apostolic authority. The rise of Montanism, a charismatic movement emphasizing new prophecies and strict moral discipline, inadvertently damaged the apocalypse of Peter's reputation. Montanists embraced the text's harsh moral tone and detailed prophetic visions, using it to support their own controversial teachings. Mainstream church leaders, already suspicious of Montanist excesses, began to view the apocalypse of Peter as potentially dangerous to Orthodox faith. Literary criticism contributed to growing doubts about the text's value. Educated Christians compared it unfavorably to the revelation of John, finding Peter's visions less sophisticated in their symbolism and theological insight. The Apocalypse of Peter seemed to appeal primarily to simple believers who preferred concrete imagery over deeper spiritual truths. Practical concerns about the text's effects on Christian behavior also emerged. Some church leaders noticed that communities emphasizing the Apocalypse of Peter developed unhealthy preoccupations with sin and punishment. Instead of producing joy and spiritual growth, the text seemed to generate anxiety and legalistic approaches to faith that hindered rather than helped Christian maturity. The growing influence of Alexandrian theology, with its emphasis on spiritual rather than literal interpretation of Scripture, created an intellectual climate hostile to the apocalypse of Peter's straightforward approach. Scholars like Origen preferred texts that yielded rich allegorical meanings rather than simple moral lessons. The apocalypse of Peter seemed too obvious, too lacking in hidden depths to satisfy sophisticated theological inquiry. Economic factors may have played a role in the text's decline. The expense of copying manuscripts meant that Christian communities had to make choices about which books to preserve and transmit. As doubts grew about the apocalypse of Peter's authenticity and value, scribes and patrons began to invest their resources in texts with stronger claims to apostolic authority and theological importance. The case for exclusion gained momentum through cumulative effect rather than any single decisive argument. Multiple concerns combined to create doubt where once there had been confidence. The apocalypse of Peter's supporters found themselves fighting on too many fronts simultaneously, unable to address all the objections raised against their beloved text. Eusebius and the Power to Erase History remembers Eusebius of Caesarea as the father of church history, but his true power lay in shaping which memories would survive. In his great work, The Ecclesiastical History, completed around 325, this scholarly bishop created categories that would determine the countless Christian texts for centuries to come. His pen became a sword that could elevate writings to sacred status or consign them to the shadows of doubt. Eusebius divided Christian literature into 4 careful categories. The accepted books included the 4 Gospels, Paul's letters, and other texts that enjoyed universal recognition. The disputed books had some support but faced questions about authenticity or doctrine. The spurious writings bore names of apostles but clearly came from later authors. The heretical books promoted false teachings that threatened Orthodox faith. The Apocalypse of Peter found itself placed in the disputed category, a classification that carried the weight of scholarly authority throughout the Christian world. Eusebius acknowledged the text's popularity and historical support while expressing reservations about its ultimate value. This measured judgment reflected his careful methodology, but it also sealed the text's fate in ways he may not have fully anticipated. Eusebius possessed access to libraries and archives that few contemporaries could match. His position as Bishop of Caesarea gave him connections to Christian communities across the Eastern Empire. He could consult manuscripts, interview elderly believers, and trace the transmission of texts through multiple generations. This extensive research gave his judgments unusual authority among church leaders seeking guidance about contested writings. The historian's personal theological preferences influenced his evaluations in subtle but significant ways. Eusebius favored texts that supported imperial Christianity's emphasis on order, authority, and unity. The apocalypse of Peter's graphic imagery and appeal to popular religious sensibilities made him uncomfortable. He preferred the sophisticated symbolism of John's revelation and the theological depth of Paul's letters. Eusebius also had to navigate the political realities of his time. Emperor Constantine had recently converted to Christianity, ending centuries of persecution, but creating new pressures for religious uniformity. Church councils were beginning to address doctrinal disputes that threatened Christian unity. In this environment, texts like the Apocalypse of Peter seemed potentially divisive rather than helpful for building consensus. The historian's influence extended far beyond his own lifetime through the copying and preservation of his works. Medieval scribes treated Eusebius as the ultimate authority on early Christian literature. His categories became standard reference points for determining which texts deserved study and which could be safely ignored. The disputed label attached to the Apocalypse of Peter discouraged copying and transmission in ways that proved increasingly fatal over time. Regional differences in manuscript preservation amplified Eusebius's impact. Communities in the Eastern Empire, where his influence was strongest, gradually abandoned texts he had questioned. Western churches maintained some disputed writings longer, but eventually followed Eastern precedents in most cases. The Apocalypse of Peter survived longer in Egypt and Syria than in Greece or Asia Minor, but even these strongholds eventually succumbed to scholarly consensus. Eusebius's methodology, while impressive for its time, contained biases that modern scholars recognize but ancient readers accepted without question. He privileged written testimony over oral tradition, formal theological discourse over popular religious expression, and institutional authority over grassroots acceptance. These preferences systematically disadvantaged texts like the Apocalypse of Peter that had thrived in different contexts. The historian's treatment of apocalyptic literature reflected broader changes in Christian intellectual culture. The church was moving away from expectation of imminent divine intervention toward accommodation with existing social and political structures. Graphic visions of divine judgment seemed less relevant to Christians who were beginning to exercise earthly power themselves. Eusebius embodied this shift in his scholarly preferences and canonical judgments. Economic factors reinforced the effects of Eusebius's scholarly authority. Manuscript copying remained expensive and time-consuming throughout the ancient and medieval periods. Christian communities had to make choices about which texts to preserve and transmit. Once Eusebius had labeled the Apocalypse of Peter as disputed, patrons and scribes naturally prioritized resources for texts with stronger scholarly endorsement. The irony of Eusebius's power lies in its unintended consequences. By creating systematic categories for evaluating Christian literature, he provided tools that later scholars could use to question his own judgments. Modern discoveries of ancient manuscripts have revealed the popularity and influence of texts he dismissed or marginalized. The Apocalypse of Peter has found new life precisely because contemporary scholars recognize the limitations of 4th century canonical decisions. Eusebius wielded his pen with careful precision, but the cumulative effect of his judgments reshaped Christian memory in ways that continue to influence religious understanding today. The texts he preserved became scripture, while those he questioned faded into scholarly footnotes. His categories seemed objective and neutral, but they carried the full weight of imperial Christianity's emerging orthodoxy. The Apocalypse of Peter became a casualty of this process, neither heretical enough to generate passionate opposition nor accepted enough to ensure preservation. Hell evolves. The medieval mind possessed an appetite for divine punishment that would have impressed even the author of the Apocalypse of Peter. But where the ancient text offered simple moral equations, later Christians demanded elaborate theological systems that could map the geography of damnation with scientific precision. Hell evolved from Peter's straightforward vision into something far more complex and terrifying. Dante Alighieri stood in his study one winter evening in 1308, surrounded by manuscripts and memories of political exile. He had lost everything he once valued: his city, his position, his certainty about divine justice. The inferno that poured from his pen over the following years would transform Christian imagination more completely than any text since the New Testament itself. Yet, traces of the Apocalypse of Peter whispered through his carefully constructed circles of punishment. The connection between Peter's visions and Dante's masterpiece runs deeper than mere literary influence. Both texts sought to make abstract concepts of divine justice concrete and memorable. Both authors understood that moral instruction required vivid imagery that would linger in readers' minds long after the immediate reading experience ended. Both recognize that fear of punishment, while not the highest motivation for righteous living, remained a powerful tool for shaping human behavior. Medieval theologians had systematized punishment in ways that would have astonished early Christians. They developed precise categories for different types of sin, matching each transgression with appropriate eternal consequences. The Apocalypse of Peter's relatively simple catalog of torments gave way to elaborate schemes that accounted for every possible moral failure with mathematical precision. Thomas Aquinas contributed philosophical rigor to discussions of eternal punishment that elevated speculation to the level of systematic theology. His Summa Theologica devoted careful attention to questions about the nature of hellish torment, the relationship between spiritual and physical punishment, and the justice of eternal consequences for temporal sins. These scholarly discussions moved far beyond the vivid but unsophisticated imagery of the Apocalypse of Peter. Art and architecture carried hell's evolution into popular consciousness through channels that reached believers who never read theological treatises. Cathedral sculptures depicted the damned with increasing graphic detail, while illuminated manuscripts provided intimate glimpses of punishment that made Peter's visions seem almost restrained by comparison. The Last Judgment became a favorite subject for artists who competed to create the most memorable images of divine wrath. Mystery plays brought hell to life on medieval stages with mechanical ingenuity that delighted audiences hungry for spectacle. Elaborate stage devices created the impression of real fire and smoke, while actors costumed as demons tormented the wicked with theatrical enthusiasm. These performances made the abstract concepts of eternal punishment immediate and entertaining in ways that ancient texts could never achieve. The Black Death of the 14th century intensified Christian preoccupation with death and judgment in ways that created new audiences for infernal literature. Survivors of the plague sought meaning in their suffering and assurance that divine justice would ultimately prevail. Texts describing punishment of the wicked provided psychological comfort to believers struggling to understand why God had permitted such widespread devastation. Purgatory emerged as a theological innovation that addressed practical pastoral concerns about the fate of ordinary believers who died neither perfectly righteous nor utterly wicked. This middle state required its own geography and population, leading to elaborate descriptions that paralleled but did not replace traditional hell. The Apocalypse of Peter's binary division between saved and damned seemed increasingly inadequate for addressing complex moral realities. Renaissance humanism introduced new perspectives on human dignity that created tension with traditional emphasis on punishment and divine wrath. Scholars rediscovering classical literature found Greek and Roman approaches to ethics that emphasized virtue rather than fear as the primary motivation for good behavior. These influences gradually undermined the cultural foundations that had supported texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. Protestant reformers retained belief in hell while rejecting many medieval elaborations as unscriptural speculation. Martin Luther and John Calvin emphasized divine sovereignty and human depravity in ways that made eternal punishment seem both necessary and just. But they preferred biblical imagery to the creative expansions that had characterized medieval treatments of the subject. The printing press democratized access to literature about punishment and damnation, while simultaneously making it easier for critics to compare different texts and identify inconsistencies. Readers could now examine multiple descriptions of hell side by side, noting contradictions and questioning traditional authorities. The Apocalypse of Peter's relatively simple approach began to seem primitive compared to more sophisticated alternatives. Scientific advances created new challenges for literal interpretations of physical punishment in hell. Improved understanding of anatomy, physics, and geography made traditional descriptions seem increasingly implausible to educated believers. Theologians responded by emphasizing spiritual rather than physical aspects of eternal punishment, further distancing themselves from the concrete imagery that had made the Apocalypse of Peter compelling to ancient audiences. Modern psychology has reframed traditional concerns about guilt and punishment in ways that make ancient apocalyptic literature seem psychologically unhealthy rather than spiritually beneficial. Contemporary Christians often view emphasis on fear and punishment as obstacles to spiritual growth, rather than aids to moral development. The apocalypse of Peter's pedagogical approach conflicts with therapeutic models of religious formation that dominate current pastoral practice. Hell continues to evolve in popular culture through literature, film, and digital media that adapt traditional themes for contemporary audiences. But these modern treatments typically emphasize entertainment value over moral instruction, reversing the priorities that motivated ancient apocalyptic authors. The apocalypse of Peter's earnest concern with righteousness seems almost quaint compared to current approaches to infernal imagery. The lost Christianities. In the hidden corners of ancient libraries, forgotten voices whisper stories of what might have been. Christianity as we know it represents only one branch of a vast tree that once grew in many directions. The apocalypse of Peter stands as testimony to roads not taken, possibilities that existed before councils and emperors decided which version of faith would survive. The earliest Christian communities resembled a marketplace more than a unified movement. Followers of Jesus gathered in house churches scattered across the Mediterranean world, each group developing its own understanding of their master's teachings. Some emphasized his divinity, while others focused on his humanity. Some treasured his moral instructions, while others sought mystical union with his spirit. The apocalypse of Peter emerged from this creative chaos, offering one community's vision of ultimate truth. Gnostic Christians possessed secret knowledge that promised liberation from the material world's limitations. Their texts described a complex spiritual universe filled with divine emanations and cosmic struggles between light and darkness. The apocalypse of Peter seemed crude and materialistic to believers who sought escape from physical existence rather than its transformation through divine judgment. Jewish Christians maintained synagogue worship while accepting Jesus as Messiah, creating a hybrid faith that honored both traditions. They followed dietary laws, observed Sabbath rest, and required male converts to undergo circumcision. The apocalypse of Peter's emphasis on moral behavior resonated with their concern for righteous living, but its Gentile authorship and Greek cultural assumptions limited its appeal within their communities. Marcionite churches rejected the Hebrew scriptures entirely, viewing the Old Testament God as a different deity from the loving Father revealed by Jesus. They created their own canon consisting only of Luke's Gospel and Paul's letters, edited to remove Jewish influences. The apocalypse of Peter's graphic descriptions of punishment seemed to reflect the harsh justice of the Hebrew God they had rejected rather than the mercy of the Christian Father they worshipped. Montanist communities expected new prophecies to continue the revelations given to the original apostles. They practiced strict moral discipline and prepared for Christ's imminent return to establish his earthly kingdom. The apocalypse of Peter's prophetic style and detailed eschatology appealed to believers who valued ongoing divine communication, but its attribution to an ancient apostle conflicted with their emphasis on contemporary spiritual gifts. Ebionite Christians viewed Jesus as a human prophet rather than divine savior, emphasizing his role as teacher and example rather than cosmic redeemer. They practiced voluntary poverty and communal sharing while maintaining Jewish ritual observances. The apocalypse of Peter's moral teachings aligned with their values, but its supernatural elements seemed inconsistent with their rationalistic approach to religious truth. Docetic believers taught that Christ only appeared to have a physical body, arguing that divine spirit could not truly unite with corrupt matter. They emphasized Jesus' heavenly origin and eternal nature while minimizing his human experiences. The apocalypse of Peter's concrete imagery of physical punishment and resurrection seemed to contradict their understanding of reality as fundamentally spiritual rather than material. Each Christian community possessed its own collection of sacred texts that reflected particular theological perspectives and pastoral needs. Rural churches treasured simple moral instructions, while urban congregations preferred sophisticated theological treatises. Wealthy patrons funded copying of texts that supported their social positions, while persecuted minorities preserved writings that offered comfort in suffering. The process of canonization involved political and economic factors that had little to do with spiritual truth or apostolic authority. Bishops with imperial connections could promote their preferred texts while marginalizing alternatives. Wealthy churches could afford to copy and distribute their chosen scriptures, while poorer communities had to accept whatever manuscripts they could obtain. Regional differences in Christian practice created islands of diversity that preserved alternative traditions long after they had disappeared elsewhere. The Apocalypse of Peter maintained pockets of support in Egypt and Syria, while fading from memory in Greece and Italy. These geographical variations reflected local theological preferences and cultural assumptions rather than objective evaluations of textual authority. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the diversity of early Christian belief and practice in ways that challenge traditional narratives about Orthodox development. Papyrus fragments preserve texts that were thought to have been completely lost, while inscriptions document communities that followed different ritual practices and theological teachings than those described in surviving literature. The suppression of alternative Christianities involved both active persecution and passive neglect. Church leaders denounced heretical teachings while refusing to copy or preserve disputed texts. Economic pressures reinforced theological judgments as communities invested limited resources in manuscripts that enjoyed official approval rather than those marked by scholarly suspicion. Recovering these lost voices requires careful archaeological and literary detective work that pieces together fragmentary evidence from multiple sources. The Apocalypse of Peter survived only because desert sands preserved papyrus fragments that might otherwise have crumbled into dust. Most alternative Christian texts probably disappeared without leaving any trace in the historical record. Modern Christianity might have developed very differently if political circumstances had favored different theological traditions, or if economic factors had preserved alternative textual collections. The Apocalypse of Peter's vivid moral imagery might have shaped Christian art and literature in ways that would seem familiar rather than exotic to contemporary believers. Questions about canonical authority might have been resolved through different criteria that valued popular acceptance over scholarly approval. The lost Christianities remind us that religious traditions develop through historical processes that involve human choices rather than inevitable divine guidance. The texts that survive canonization reflect the preferences and prejudices of particular communities at specific moments in time. The Apocalypse of Peter's exclusion from the biblical canon tells us as much about 4th century Christianity as it does about the text itself. Rediscovery and modern shock. The winter of 1886 brought French archaeologist Urbain Bourriant more than seasonal cold to his excavation site near Akhmim, Egypt. Inside a tomb that had protected its contents from centuries of desert storms, his team discovered a leather-bound codex containing texts that scholarship had long considered lost forever. Among these ancient treasures lay fragments of the Apocalypse of Peter, waiting to shock the modern world with visions that had terrified and inspired believers 15 centuries earlier. Bourriant's initial examination of the manuscript revealed writing in Greek that seemed both familiar and startling. The text claimed apostolic authority while describing scenes of divine punishment that exceeded anything in the accepted biblical canon. Early translations circulated among European scholars who responded with mixtures of fascination and revulsion to descriptions they had known only through secondhand references in ancient church histories. The academic world of the late 19th century possessed limited experience with non-canonical Christian literature. Scholars had focused primarily on establishing reliable texts of biblical books rather than exploring the broader diversity of early Christian writing. The discovery of the Apocalypse of Peter opened windows into a religious universe that seemed both more complex and more disturbing than traditional histories had suggested. Protestant scholars found themselves in an awkward position when confronting the newly discovered text. Their tradition emphasized biblical authority while rejecting later additions to the apostolic testimony. The Apocalypse of Peter claimed ancient credentials while containing material that seemed to contradict their understanding of Christian teaching. This tension forced uncomfortable questions about how canonical decisions had been made and whether they could be revised. Catholic researchers approached the discovery with different assumptions but similar uncertainty. Their tradition acknowledged the authority of church councils and papal decisions in determining canonical boundaries. The Apocalypse of Peter had been explicitly rejected by early church authorities, making its contents historically interesting but theologically irrelevant. Yet, the text's vivid imagery and moral concerns resonated with Catholic traditions of art and devotion in ways that complicated simple dismissal. German higher criticism had prepared some scholars to expect diversity and development in early Christian literature. These researchers viewed the Apocalypse of Peter as valuable evidence for understanding how Christian communities had interpreted Jesus' teachings in different historical contexts. They emphasized historical analysis over theological judgment, treating the text as a window into ancient religious consciousness rather than a potential source of contemporary spiritual authority. Public reaction to press coverage of the discovery revealed widespread fascination with apocalyptic themes that respectable Christianity had tried to minimize or spiritualize. Newspaper accounts of Peter's visions attracted readers hungry for concrete details about the afterlife that their pastors typically avoided discussing. The text's graphic imagery seemed to satisfy curiosity about ultimate questions that modern theology had left deliberately vague. Comparative religion scholars found in the Apocalypse of Peter evidence for theories about the development of religious ideas across different cultures and historical periods. They noted parallels between Peter's descriptions of punishment and similar themes in Egyptian, Persian, and Greek traditions. These connections suggested that Christian apocalyptic literature had borrowed from older sources while adapting their content for new theological purposes. Art historians recognized visual motifs in medieval Christian art that seemed to echo descriptions found in the newly discovered text. Cathedral sculptures and illuminated manuscripts contain details that matched the Apocalypse of Peter's imagery more closely than anything in the canonical Bible. This discovery suggested that the ancient text had influenced Christian artistic tradition even after its exclusion from official scripture. Psychological interpretations of the text emphasized its revelation of human anxieties about moral failure and divine judgment that transcended particular historical periods. Sigmund Freud and other pioneers of depth psychology saw in Peter's visions evidence for unconscious fears and desires that shaped religious expression across cultures. The text's appeal seemed to reflect universal psychological needs rather than specifically Christian theological concerns. Literary critics placed the Apocalypse of Peter within the broader tradition of visionary literature that included Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. They noted how ancient Christian authors had used similar techniques of moral instruction through vivid imagery that modern writers continued to employ for different purposes. The text seemed to represent an important link in the development of Western literary tradition. Archaeological discoveries in Egypt continued to yield additional fragments and complete manuscripts that expanded scholarly understanding of early Christian diversity. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, contained dozens of texts that had been lost for over a millennium. These finds created new appreciation for the complexity of ancient Christianity while raising questions about which voices had been silenced in the process of canonical formation. Feminist scholars found in texts like the Apocalypse of Peter evidence for women's participation in early Christian communities that later Orthodoxy had minimized or erased. While the text itself reflected patriarchal assumptions common to its time, the mere fact of its preservation suggested networks of believers that included women as teachers, copyists, and spiritual authorities. Digital humanities projects have made the Apocalypse of Peter accessible to global audiences in ways that would have been impossible for previous generations of scholars. Online databases provide multiple translations, while hyperlinked annotations connect the text to related materials and contemporary scholarship. These technological advances have democratized access to ancient Christian literature while creating new possibilities for comparative analysis and interpretation. The rediscovery of the Apocalypse of Peter continues to generate scholarly debate about the boundaries of early Christianity and the criteria used for determining canonical authority. Some researchers argue for inclusive approaches that value diversity and historical accident, while others maintain that theological quality and apostolic authenticity provide necessary standards for distinguishing authentic from spurious traditions. The psychology of fear. Fear possesses a peculiar power to focus the human mind on ultimate questions that prosperity and comfort allow us to avoid. The early Christians who embraced the apocalypse of Peter lived in a world where death arrived without warning and justice seemed constantly deferred. Their attraction to detailed descriptions of divine punishment reflected psychological needs that transcended mere morbid curiosity or primitive superstition. Terror served as teacher in ways that gentle instruction could not match. A merchant tempted to use false weights might forget abstract lessons about honesty, but vivid images of cheaters hanging by their tongues over lakes of fire created memories that would surface at crucial moments of moral decision. The Apocalypse of Peter understood that ethical behavior often depends more on imagination than reason. Ancient minds operated within frameworks of honor and shame that made public humiliation seem worse than private suffering. The text's emphasis on exposure and recognition in the afterlife appealed to believers who understood reputation as more valuable than life itself. The prospect of eternal shame before divine and human witnesses provided motivation that surpassed fear of physical pain alone. Guilt required concrete expression to become psychologically manageable for people who lacked modern therapeutic vocabularies. The Apocalypse of Peter offered specific punishments that matched particular sins in ways that allowed believers to visualize their own moral failures and imagine appropriate consequences. This correspondence between crime and punishment provided psychological relief through the promise that justice would ultimately prevail. Social control operated through fear more effectively than through positive reinforcement in communities where resources remained scarce and competition intense. The text's detailed catalog of punishments served community leaders who needed tools for maintaining order and discipline. Threats of eternal consequences carried weight that temporary penalties could not match, especially among believers who expected Christ's return within their lifetimes. Childhood experiences of punishment and reward created psychological patterns that made adult believers receptive to similar frameworks in religious contexts. The Apocalypse of Peter spoke to people who had learned moral lessons through physical discipline and social disapproval. Its imagery resonated with memories of parental authority and communal judgment that shaped their understanding of divine governance. Trauma from persecution and social marginalization created psychological wounds that required explanation and comfort. The text's promise that current sufferers would witness their oppressors' punishment provided emotional healing for believers who struggled to maintain faith despite ongoing hardship. Visions of divine justice offered hope that present circumstances did not reflect ultimate reality or permanent conditions. Group identity formation benefited from shared fears that distinguished insiders from outsiders while creating solidarity among community members. The Apocalypse of Peter provided common language and imagery that allowed believers to recognize each other while maintaining boundaries against threatening external influences. Collective terror became a source of belonging rather than isolation. Psychological projection allowed believers to displace personal anxieties onto external enemies while maintaining positive self-images. The text's condemnation of specific sins enabled readers to identify themselves with the righteous while viewing their opponents as destined for punishment. This mechanism protected fragile egos while reinforcing community loyalty and doctrinal commitment. Ritual purification practices gained meaning through fear of spiritual contamination that the text described in graphic detail. Believers who might otherwise view baptism, fasting, or confession as empty ceremonies found deeper significance when they understood these practices as protection against eternal consequences. Fear transformed routine religious observances into desperate necessities for spiritual survival. Conversion experiences often involved dramatic shifts from terror to relief as potential believers moved from identification with the damned to assurance of salvation. The Apocalypse of Peter provided before and after narratives that helped converts understand their spiritual transformation in concrete terms. The text's imagery gave emotional weight to abstract theological concepts about justification and redemption. Memory techniques in oral cultures relied heavily on emotional associations to preserve important information across generations. The text's shocking descriptions created unforgettable mental images that transmitted moral lessons more effectively than systematic ethical instruction. Fear became a pedagogical tool that served communities lacking widespread literacy or formal educational institutions. Dreams and visions frequently incorporated elements from religious texts that believers had memorized or heard repeatedly. The apocalypse of Peter's vivid imagery appeared in personal spiritual experiences that seemed to confirm the text's authority and relevance. These psychological phenomena created feedback loops that reinforced belief in the text's divine inspiration and prophetic accuracy. Seasonal cycles of anxiety and celebration found expression through religious practices that emphasized either judgment or mercy, depending on liturgical context. The text provided appropriate readings for penitential seasons when communities focused on moral examination and spiritual discipline. Fear served as preparation for joy rather than an end in itself within these carefully structured religious calendars. Mental illness in ancient contexts often manifested through religious language and imagery that reflected the sufferer's cultural background and spiritual concerns. The apocalypse of Peter's descriptions of punishment may have influenced how some believers experienced and expressed psychological distress. Communities that emphasize divine judgment might inadvertently have intensified rather than relieved emotional suffering among vulnerable members. Authority structures within Christian communities gained legitimacy through association with divine judgment that the text described in compelling detail. Leaders who claimed apostolic succession or prophetic gifts could point to Peter's visions as evidence for their spiritual authority. Fear of eternal punishment made believers more willing to accept human guidance and submit to institutional discipline. Therapeutic functions of religious fear operated through controlled exposure to anxiety-provoking imagery within supportive community contexts. The text allowed believers to confront their deepest terrors about death and judgment while surrounded by fellow believers who shared similar concerns. This collective processing of existential anxiety provided psychological benefits that individual contemplation could not achieve. Cognitive dissonance between lived experience and religious promises created internal tension that required psychological resolution. When believers suffered while their enemies prospered, the apocalypse of Peter offered explanations that preserved faith by projecting justice into the future. This temporal displacement allowed communities to maintain hope, despite evidence that seemed to contradict divine providence. Echoes in art and culture. The great cathedral of Autun rose from French soil in the 12th century, its stones carved with images that would have made the author of the Apocalypse of Peter proud. Above the main entrance, Gislebertus sculpted a Last Judgment scene where the damned writhed in torments remarkably similar to those described in the ancient text. Demons dragged sinners toward gaping mouths of hell, while angels weighed souls with divine precision. The medieval artist had never read Peter's visions, yet his chisel seemed guided by the same moral imagination that had shaped the ancient apocalypse. Gothic cathedrals across Europe became galleries of infernal instruction where Peter's influence whispered through stone and glass. Chartres, Notre Dame, Amiens, each magnificent structure incorporated visual elements that echoed the text's systematic approach to divine punishment. Wealthy patrons commissioned these massive projects partly to educate illiterate believers about moral consequences that sermons alone could not convey effectively. Illuminated manuscripts preserved Peter's imagery in more intimate settings where individual readers could study detailed depictions of punishment and redemption. Books of Hours contained miniature paintings that brought the text's visions into private devotional practices. Noble families treasured these artistic treasures that combined spiritual instruction with aesthetic pleasure, making moral lessons beautiful as well as memorable. Mystery plays transformed Peter's static descriptions into dynamic theatrical performances that engaged audiences through multiple senses simultaneously. Actors costumed as demons used mechanical devices to simulate the punishments described in ancient apocalyptic literature. These productions made abstract theological concepts immediate and entertaining, while preserving traditional moral teachings for illiterate populations. Dante's Divine Comedy represents the most sophisticated artistic transformation of themes that originated in texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. The Italian poet created a systematic geography of the afterlife that surpassed ancient visions in both literary quality and theological depth. Yet traces of Peter's influence appear throughout the Inferno's carefully constructed punishments that match specific sins with appropriate consequences. Renaissance artists continued to draw inspiration from apocalyptic imagery while adapting traditional themes for new aesthetic sensibilities. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes combined classical artistic techniques with Christian moral instruction that would have been familiar to readers of the Apocalypse of Peter. The artist's powerful figures embodied spiritual truths in visual forms that transcended particular historical periods or cultural contexts. Protestant Reformation created new tensions around religious art that had traditionally incorporated apocalyptic themes. Reformed churches rejected elaborate visual programs as potential sources of idolatry while maintaining belief in divine judgment and eternal punishment. This theological shift reduced artistic expression of themes that the Apocalypse of Peter had helped establish in Christian imagination. Baroque artists like Hieronymus Bosch pushed apocalyptic imagery to new extremes of fantasy and horror that exceeded even the Apocalypse of Peter's graphic descriptions. The Garden of Earthly Delights and similar works created surreal landscapes of sin and punishment that reflected both traditional Christian themes and individual artistic vision. These masterpieces demonstrated the continued appeal of moral instruction through shocking visual imagery. Literature continued to adapt apocalyptic themes for new audiences and purposes throughout the modern period. John Milton's Paradise Lost, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and countless other works drew on traditions that traced back to ancient texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. These authors transformed primitive moral instruction into sophisticated artistic expression while preserving essential elements of the original vision. Folk traditions preserved apocalyptic imagery through oral stories, songs, and customs that transmitted moral lessons across generations without formal literary education. Rural communities maintained beliefs about divine judgment and eternal punishment that reflected ancient concerns even when they lacked direct access to the texts that had first articulated these ideas. Cultural memory preserved essential elements while adapting surface details to local contexts. Cinema discovered in apocalyptic themes rich material for visual storytelling that could reach mass audiences with unprecedented effectiveness. Films like The Seventh Seal, The Exorcist, and countless others drew on religious traditions that included influence from texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. These modern productions used sophisticated technical capabilities to create images that surpassed ancient imaginations while serving similar functions of moral instruction and emotional catharsis. Digital media has created new possibilities for experiencing apocalyptic imagery through interactive games, virtual reality, and online communities that explore themes of judgment and redemption. These technological innovations allow contemporary audiences to experience moral choices and their consequences in ways that would have amazed ancient believers who relied on static texts and oral instruction. Horror fiction found in apocalyptic traditions rich sources of imagery and psychological insight that could terrify modern readers while exploring fundamental questions about human nature and moral responsibility. Authors like Clive Barker, Stephen King, and others created works that updated ancient concerns about divine judgment for contemporary audiences who might reject traditional religious frameworks while remaining fascinated by questions of ultimate justice. Graphic novels and comic books adapted apocalyptic themes for visual storytelling that combined literary narrative with artistic expression. These popular media forms reached audiences that might never encounter traditional religious texts, while preserving essential elements of moral instruction through entertaining and accessible presentations. Contemporary art installations have incorporated apocalyptic imagery to comment on modern social and political issues, while drawing on traditional religious symbolism that traces back to ancient texts. Artists use familiar visual languages to communicate new messages about environmental destruction, social inequality, and other contemporary concerns that seem to require prophetic warning and moral judgment. Music across various genres has continued to draw inspiration from apocalyptic themes that originated in texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. From medieval chants to modern metal, composers have found in these ancient visions material for artistic expression that resonates with universal human concerns about justice, punishment, and redemption. The text's influence echoes through centuries of musical development in ways that demonstrate its enduring psychological and spiritual relevance. The forbidden door remains open. The ancient papyrus crumbles at the edges, its Greek letters fading into the desert sand from which modern archaeologists rescued it over a century ago. Yet something in the Apocalypse of Peter refuses to die. In university libraries and digital archives, behind locked doors of rare book collections and hidden in plain sight on internet servers, Peter's visions continue to whisper their uncomfortable truths to anyone brave enough to listen. We like to think we have moved beyond such primitive fears, that our sophisticated understanding of psychology and theology has freed us from crude images of divine punishment. Our churches speak of love rather than wrath, therapy rather than judgment, healing rather than condemnation. We have domesticated God, made the divine safe for suburban sensibilities and corporate mission statements. But late at night, when sleep eludes us and conscience stirs, Peter's ancient terrors still have power to disturb our carefully constructed peace. The text endures because it speaks to something deeper than theological sophistication or cultural refinement. It addresses the human hunger for justice that no amount of rationalization can fully satisfy. We watch evil prosper and innocence suffer, then tell ourselves that moral consequences are merely social constructions or evolutionary adaptations. But Peter's visions insist that the universe has a moral structure that will ultimately assert itself despite all appearances to the contrary. Modern horror fiction, from the subtle psychological terror of Shirley Jackson to the graphic violence of contemporary cinema, draws on the same well of anxiety that nourished the Apocalypse of Peter. Our entertainment industry has built entire genres around the premise that moral violations must be punished, that justice will eventually prevail, that the wicked cannot escape consequences forever. We have secularized Peter's vision while preserving its essential structure and emotional appeal. Environmental destruction and climate change have created new contexts for apocalyptic thinking that make ancient texts seem almost prophetic. The Apocalypse of Peter's warnings about divine judgment find echoes in contemporary predictions about planetary catastrophe resulting from human moral failure. We face the possibility that our species' ethical choices may determine our survival, giving new relevance to ancient concerns about ultimate consequences. Social media platforms have created digital spaces where moral judgment operates with the swift certainty that Peter's visions promised. Online communities identify transgressors, mobilize collective punishment, and create reputational consequences that can destroy lives with remarkable efficiency. The internet has democratized the power of moral enforcement while stripping away the mercy and forgiveness that traditional religious frameworks typically included alongside their warnings about judgment. Psychological research continues to reveal the ways that human beings require moral frameworks to maintain mental health and social cooperation. We seem to need beliefs about justice and consequences to function effectively in groups and find meaning in individual existence. The Apocalypse of Peter understood this necessity long before behavioral science could explain its evolutionary origins or neurological mechanisms. Political movements across the ideological spectrum regularly invoke apocalyptic language that echoes themes from ancient texts like the Apocalypse of Peter. Both progressive and conservative voices warn about moral decay leading to social collapse, identify specific sins that threaten communal survival, and promise that justice will ultimately prevail over current inequities. The text's rhetorical strategies continue to shape public discourse in ways that most speakers and listeners never recognize. Therapeutic approaches to guilt and shame often struggle to provide the psychological resolution that more primitive systems of moral accountability seemed to offer. Contemporary counseling emphasizes self acceptance and forgiveness, while sometimes leaving clients with unresolved feelings about their own moral failures. The apocalypse of Peter's clear categories and definitive consequences provided psychological closure that modern therapeutic techniques may not fully replace. Religious communities continue to wrestle with questions about divine justice and human accountability that the apocalypse of Peter addressed with uncomfortable directness. Progressive denominations emphasize God's love while struggling to maintain moral standards, while conservative groups preserve traditional language about judgment while adapting to contemporary sensibilities. The text stands as a reminder of Christianity's more demanding earlier expressions that refuse to separate mercy from justice or love from moral consequence. Archaeological discoveries keep revealing new fragments and related texts that expand our understanding of early Christian diversity while raising questions about which voices were preserved and which were silenced. The Apocalypse of Peter represents thousands of similar works that disappeared when particular theological traditions gained institutional power. We can only imagine what other perspectives were lost when the early church made its canonical decisions. Digital humanities projects have made ancient texts accessible to global audiences while creating new possibilities for comparative analysis and interpretation. Anyone with internet access can now read the Apocalypse of Peter and form their own judgments about its value and relevance. This democratization of scholarly resources has changed the landscape of religious authority while giving new life to forgotten texts. The forbidden door that 19th century archaeologists opened in the Egyptian desert can never be fully closed again. Peter's visions have entered contemporary consciousness through multiple channels that ensure their preservation regardless of official religious approval or scholarly consensus. The text has become part of our cultural DNA, influencing art, literature, psychology, and spirituality in ways that transcend any particular theological framework. Perhaps the apocalypse of Peter's greatest gift to modern readers lies not in its specific moral instructions or theological claims, but in its reminder that human beings have always struggled with questions about justice, meaning, and ultimate accountability. The text forces us to confront our own assumptions about moral consequences, while challenging us to articulate better alternatives if we find its answers inadequate. The ancient papyrus continues to crumble, but the questions it raises remain as urgent today as they were 17 centuries ago. We may have changed our vocabulary and refined our categories, but we have not escaped the human need to believe that our choices matter, that justice will ultimately prevail, and that the universe has a moral structure that gives meaning to our struggles between good and evil. In this sense, the forbidden door that the Apocalypse of Peter opened will remain open as long as human beings continue to ask whether anything we do really matters in the end.